There's been so much said about Neon Genesis Evangelion over the years. I really wish I did have a unique perspective or an interesting take on the series as a whole. I really don't know much of anything about Evangelion, though. That is, aside from one thing that I can say for certain. The titles of the rebuilds are absolute genius. To be clear here, I am talking about the English titles of the rebuild films. Evangelion 1.0, You Are Not Alone, Evangelion 2.0, You Cannot Advance, and Evangelion 3.0, You Cannot Redo. However, I would consider these the actual titles of the film as they are on the theatrical posters, even in the Japanese versions. And Evangelion as a series itself always did have its title cards written in English. Now, what's really impressive about the Evangelion movie titles is that they contain the inherent ambiguity that the show itself is centered around. Every single word in the title, aside from maybe alone, advance, and redo, contains some form of ambiguity or ability to be read as its opposite. I think when looking at them for the first time, anyone's going to notice the not in parentheses. It's a huge giveaway, and it really cuts up the sentence in English so you don't read it all the way through once. You have to stop and consider the brackets. So it's pausing the reader of the title to say, you should look at this again. Which gives validity to the fact that we're thinking about this even in this level of depth. And even if that wasn't the case, it would still be Evangelion, so that alone would merit this kind of level of analysis of 4 or 5 words. The not being in parentheses indicates uncertainty. They're not sure whether you can advance or not. They're not sure whether you can redo or not. It's almost like the famous Borat joke. You can advance. Nah. The brackets seem like an interjection. They're saying, you can advance. However, another entity is coming in and saying you cannot advance or you are not alone. This is also independent of the double reading that the word can has in English. Now, I know in formal English, the word may would be used in this circumstance, but the usage of the word may in that context has been on steady decline in American English for quite a while, to the point where it would be very rare to hear someone say, you may advance. So we can consider the word can in this position to embody both permission and ability. That is, the subject of the sentence is permitted, but is also able to advance, or is not permitted and not able to advance or redo. This is extremely interesting because that ambiguity does not inherently exist within the Japanese language. You can say dekiru, to be able to do something, and then you have another form of a sentence structure which would say, am not allowed to do something. Really, the only way to obtain this ambiguity is to write the title in English. And I want to stop here and talk about how this connects to the show before we go on to the subject of the sentence. Because that's so fundamental to what Evangelion is talking about. Are the limits we impose imposed by ourselves or by the people surrounding us? That's a huge part of what 3.0 is talking about, with Shinji not being able to get in the mech, instead of having his reservations to get in the mech. It bleeds back to the Hedgehog's dilemma from the series. The question of agency is everywhere around Evangelion. So too is the external not, the external force acting on the sentence. There's Gendo, there's Masato, there's Seele, there's a number of different external forces that are all acting to do something here. And their act is usually denying or rejecting Shinji's agency, or his ability to advance, redo, or be alone. That said, that's not the entirety of these titles. There's still the subject of the sentence, you. Clearly, we can take this to mean the main character, sort of audience insert of Shinji. He's the character most obviously rejected from advancing or redoing anything. I think there's a very strong reading of this, though, with you as the viewer, you as maybe Evangelion fans in general, or as a whole. Hideaki Anno has always had some sort of a tumultuous relationship with the success of Evangelion and its fans, which is very heavily embodied in End of Evangelion. When these sequels came out, and Evangelion still being so popular after so long, having been transformed into something else that he may not have intended it to be, with hilariously out of character shaving cream ads and pachinko machines. If you is the rabid Evangelion fan base that infantilized Rei and Asuka and turned Evangelion into something it was not meant to be, you cannot redo. You cannot have the same thing that you had before, the same thing that you were expecting. Note 1.0, which is much the same as the series, is titled You Are Not Alone. So it doesn't have the implications of accusation in the same way that the following two do. You cannot redo. And so much of the Evangelion rebuilds is about how the same story just isn't going to play out again in the same way the second time. Or, as we've stated with the ambiguity, with Kaoru's fate, with Shinji's mental state, maybe it is going to happen again. Maybe the Evangelion fans are going to get what they want. Finally, the word at the end of the title really has some connection back to the actual movie itself. Redo is clearly for Shinji waking up after the time skip and attempting to be the hero he thought he was at the end of 2.0. You Are Not Alone is clearly about what goes on between Shinji and Rei in the first movie, everything with Gendo. And You Cannot Advance is much the same as redo, but with a slightly different connotation of moving on or progressing or doing something else. I don't think they really have multiple connotations in the same way that the previous three words do, but they provide an air of individuality to each of the films. I think it's always been incredibly clear, to me at least, that all of this is absolutely intentional and absolutely implied. Just like the show and the films themselves, the titles of the films bring up ideas and concepts and really human emotions and then question them without providing any direction or right answer or clear path, aside from the final message that the show lands on. Evangelion has always been muddy, capricious, and uncertain. I've always found it entirely fitting that their titles are just that as well.